The elevator jerked and froze between floors. Legs buzzing like they were tired of me too. I started at myself in this cracked mirror, tie crooked, shirt wrinkled, and the first roach I slipped out watching Noble of Brave. It was ugly.
Maybe it'll get stuck long enough that I won't have to walk out there pretending I still matter. I'm not proud of that thought, but if you're listening, you've probably had one just like it. The kind you don't repeat, not even to yourself. The doors opened anyway. They always do. I stepped into the corridor, nodded at people who had no idea who I was anymore, and walked out of the building like a man with a destination. I didn't have one. What I had was a rented room with thin walls, a marriage that had ended quietly, and an evening I didn't want to sit through alone. So instead of heading home, I turned left, walked 3 blocks, and pushed open the door of the small café by the harbor. The bell rang. Warm light hit my face. Familiar sounds. Familiar smells. I took my usual seat in the corner and opened my laptop, pretending to work. Ellen didn't ask what I wanted. She never did. Black coffee appeared, and on the saucer, like always, 1 extra packet of sugar. Just in case. I never used it. I told myself it was about discipline. The truth was simpler. I liked knowing someone thought I might need it. You learn things about yourself in places like that. How quickly you settle. How easily you let small kindnesses stand in for real connection. The cafe emptied early. Rain tapped the windows. Chairs flipped upside down. Ellen wiped the counter, then surprised me by pulling out the chair across from me and sitting down. No smile. No invitation. Just a tired woman taking a break. "You're here more than some of my staff," she said. "You must be attached." I should have nodded and left it there. Instead, I smiled and said, "Guess I'm loyal. Or stubborn." She didn't react, and that silence made me nervous. So I added, because I always add something when I shouldn't. Could be worse. I could be sitting alone somewhere talking to the walls. That was the first unnecessary line. I felt it land wrong, but instead of stopping, I pushed forward. I don't know why men do that. Maybe we think confidence is volume. Maybe we just hate being seen as small. I lowered my voice and said lightly, "I mean, if you really wanted me to stay, you could always say, 'I could be your wife,' and that'd settle it." The words didn't bounce back. They dropped straight to the floor. Ellen didn't laugh. She didn't get angry either. She just looked at me, long enough that I felt my face heat up. That look wasn't hurt. It wasn't flirtation. It was calculation. "Careful, boy," she said. "In a town like this, words don't stay jokes for long. And here's where I made it worse." I laughed. A small, stupid laugh. I lifted my hands and said, "Relax. Bad joke. I've got a habit of those." The moment I said it, I wanted to pull the words back. I sounded like a teenager pretending nothing mattered. She stood up. Conversation over. No lecture. No drama. Just distance. I packed up, told her good night, and walked out telling myself I hadn't crossed any real line, that I was overthinking it, that she was just being sensitive. That thought embarrassed me the second it formed, but it still showed up. That's another thing men don't admit easily. The next evening I came back. Same seat. Same time. Ellen brought the coffee. Black. Hot. She set it down and turned away. I looked at the saucer. No sugar packet. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. I stared at that empty white space longer than was reasonable for a grown man. I wanted to say something, to apologize properly this time, but instead I stayed quiet. Silence is my oldest defense. It's how I avoid making things worse. It's also how I let them die. As I packed up later, I heard her voice behind the counter. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to one of the servers. Low, steady. "He's harmless," she said. Then, after a pause, "But harmless men still leave marks if you let them linger." I felt that one land somewhere under my ribs. I stood there pretending to zip my bag while something settled in my chest. She didn't look at me. I don't know if she knew I heard. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't care. Outside, the harbor air was cold. I walked home slower than usual, replaying everything. The joke. The laugh. the missing sugar. And the worst part wasn't the fear that I'd embarrassed myself. It was the quiet suspicion that I might not be welcome there anymore. Lying in my rented room, staring at the ceiling, I asked myself the question I didn't want to answer. If it was only a joke, why did it feel like a warning? And if I went back again, would apologizing fix anything? Or just confirm that I didn't know when to leave well enough alone? I didn't decide that night. I turned off the light and let the thought sit with me, heavy and unresolved, exactly where the sugar packet used to be. I was standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, staring at two nearly identical boxes, when it hit me how quiet my life had become. Not peaceful. Quiet in the way rooms get after someone moves out and takes their voice with them. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to compare ingredients, when in reality I was just killing time so I wouldn't have to go back to the rented room and hear my own footsteps echo. If you've ever stretched a simple errand into an hour because home felt heavier than traffic, you know exactly what I mean. I bought things I didn't need, bread that would go stale, fruit I wouldn't finish, just to give the evening some shape. Back in the kitchen, I lined everything up too neatly on the counter, like order might rub off on the rest of my life. Didn't. When I reached for coffee, my hand stopped halfway to the cabinet. I stood there longer than I care to admit, then put the jar back. I told myself I was saving money. That was another lie. I left the apartment and walked, no plan, no destination. My feet carried me where they wanted to go, which should have told me something. When the harbor came into view, I slowed down. The cafe lights were on. Chairs were still down. Open. I stopped across the street and watched through the window like a teenager afraid of being seen. Ellen moved behind the counter, steady, focused. She looked the same. I didn't. Here was my choice, and it was smaller than it felt. Walk in and risk saying the wrong thing again. Or keep walking and let the silence do the job for me. I stood there long enough that a car honked behind me. I took that as a sign and crossed the street. The bell rang. Ellen looked up. No smile. No frown. Just recognition. I took my usual seat, suddenly aware of how predictable I'd become. She brought the coffee without a word. Black. Hot. I looked at the saucer. No sugar. I waited. She went back to work. Wiped the counter. Adjusted the display. Gave me space that felt earned, not kind. I stared at my coffee, then did something I hadn't planned. I stood up and carried the cup to the counter myself. Can I say something? I asked. She didn't look surprised. You already are. I shouldn't have joked like that, I said. Simple. No excuses. It wasn't fair. She studied the cup in my hands, then finally met my eyes. Most things aren't, she said. That's not new. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to explain, to defend myself, to make it lighter than it was. I swallowed it. I wasn't trying to make things awkward, I said. I just didn't want to feel invisible. There it was. Too honest. I saw it land and wondered if I'd gone too far again. She leaned against the counter, crossed her arms. Men say things like that, she said, when they want closeness without responsibility. That one stung. I opened my mouth, then closed it. She wasn't wrong, and that bothered me more than if she had been. I had another choice right then. Push back and protect my pride. Or let the comment stand and see what it did to me. I let it stand. I don't expect anything, I said quietly. That's usually the problem, she replied. We stood there in a silence that wasn't hostile but wasn't comfortable either. The kind that forces you to notice your own breathing. Finally, she reached for a saucer, set it down, and placed a sugar packet on it. One. Then she slid it halfway toward me and stopped. For now, she said. We're careful. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation. It was a line drawn lightly but clearly. I finished my coffee slower than usual. When I left, I didn't look back. Halfway home, I realized something had shifted again. Not fixed. Not broken either. Just changed shape. Back in the apartment, I sat at the small table and thought about what she'd said. About closeness. About responsibility. I wondered how many times in my life I'd wanted one without the other. I didn't have an answer. What I had was the understanding that if I kept walking into that cafe, I couldn't keep pretending nothing was at stake. That night, as I turned off the light, I knew the next decision wouldn't be about coffee or sugar or jokes. It would be about whether I was willing to stay present once the easy excuses ran out. And I wasn't sure yet if I was that man. The first time I saw my own face on someone else's phone, I didn't recognize it right away. I was standing in line at the bank, shifting my weight, listening to a young guy behind me laugh a little too loudly. I turned, half annoyed, and caught a glimpse of the screen in his hand. There I was, sitting in the corner of the cafe, head down, coffee in front of me, frozen in a frame I never agreed to. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. I walked outside with the receipt still warm in my hand and stood on the sidewalk watching the video loop. The caption was meant to be clever. Something about the regular, something about harbor life, something that made it sound harmless. People in the comments didn't know my name, but they knew my posture. They knew my age well enough to guess. They filled in the rest with confidence. I closed the app and told myself to calm down. It was nothing. People post everything now. That's what I said out loud. Inside, a smaller voice said something uglier. So this is what I look like when I think no one's watching. I didn't go to the cafe that night, or the next. I took different streets, made coffee at home that tasted like cardboard. But avoidance doesn't erase things. It just lets them grow teeth. By the third day, I'd seen the clip forwarded twice. Once with a joke. Once with a comment that said, "He's still there. Some men never move on." That one stuck. On the fourth evening, I went back. Not because I was brave, because I was angry, and anger makes decisions feel simple. The bell rang when I stepped inside. Conversations dipped, then resumed. I felt eyes on me, not hostile, just curious. That was worse. Ellen stood behind the counter. She looked up and met my eyes. No surprise, no relief, just acknowledgement. I took my usual seat and waited. She didn't bring the coffee right away. Another small message. Another adjustment I hadn't earned my way back from yet. When she finally came over, I didn't look at the saucer. I already knew what I'd find. No sugar. "Did you see it?" I asked. Too sharp. Too fast. That was my first mistake of the night. She set the cup down and said, "I did." I wanted her to be angry at the person who filmed me. I wanted her on my side immediately. Instead, she wiped the counter and said, "People record what they think tells a story. That's not a story," I said. "That's just me sitting there." She looked at me then, really looked. "You don't get to decide that anymore," she said. "Not once it's out there." That's when I felt it, the urge to defend myself at her expense. To say I was just a customer, just a guy, not responsible for how things looked. I almost said, "I didn't ask to be part of this place's image." I bit it back, but the thought still did its damage. "So what?" I said instead, quieter now. "I stop coming? Is that the solution?" She hesitated. That pause mattered. "I didn't say that," she said. "But I won't pretend it doesn't affect the room." There it was. The line I didn't want to hear. I had another choice in front of me. Push back and make it about fairness. Or sit with the fact that my presence had weight I'd been ignoring. I did neither. I tried to soften it. "I can explain," I said, "if people ask." "That usually makes it worse," she replied. The silence between us stretched. I noticed two women at a nearby table watching, not listening, just watching. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with dignity. "I don't want to hurt your business," I said finally. "Or your reputation." Ellen's expression didn't change, but her voice did. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she said. "You're old enough to know that." That one landed clean. No cruelty, no heat, just truth. I finished the coffee without tasting it. When I stood to leave, I caught my reflection in the window. The same posture from the video, the same angle. I straightened instinctively, then felt foolish for caring. Outside, the harbor air felt heavier than usual. I walked farther than I meant to, replaying everything. Not the comments, not the video, her pause, her choice of words. affect the room. At home, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the app again. The video was still there. More views, more guesses. I could report it, ask for it to be taken down. I hovered over the option longer than I should have. Another choice. Try to control the frame, or accept that some frames don't belong to you once they're released. I put the phone face down. Here's what I'll admit to you, because pretending otherwise is part of the problem. A piece of me wanted to disappear from that cafe just to prove I could. Another piece wanted to keep going back out of stubbornness, as if presence itself were a kind of argument. Neither felt right. I turned off the light knowing this much. Whatever I did next would say more about me than any stranger's video ever could. And for the first time since this all started, that scared me more than being seen. The first morning I didn't go to the cafe. I told myself it was temporary. Just a pause. A way to let things cool down. I stood in my kitchen holding a mug of instant coffee, staring at the window like it might argue with me. Didn't. The coffee tasted thin, almost metallic, and I drank it anyway because that's what men do when they've decided to endure something instead of fixing it. If I stayed away long enough, I thought, the noise would settle. People would move on. So would she. Days passed. 3, maybe 4. I stopped counting because counting made it feel intentional, and I didn't want to admit that I was choosing distance over discomfort. I took longer routes to work, changed my schedule, avoided the harbor entirely. Felt like maturity at first, like restraint. But restraint has a way of turning into absence if you're not careful. On the 5th day, I saw the cafe by accident. I was cutting through a side street to save time when the windows came into view. Lights on. Same warm glow. I slowed without meaning to and stood across the street, pretending to check my phone. Through the glass, I saw someone sitting at my old table. A man about my age. Relaxed posture. His cup sat on the saucer, and even from there, I could see it, 2 sugar packets. That detail shouldn't have mattered. It did. My chest tightened. Not with jealousy exactly, but with something quieter. Replacement. Proof that places move on even when you don't. I kept walking. I told myself I was doing the right thing. Giving her space. Protecting her business. That's how I framed it. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I didn't trust myself not to make things worse. I've always been better at leaving than staying once the ground gets unsteady. That weekend I went on a date. Not because I was ready, but because my friend insisted. Nice woman. Smart. Kind. We talked about work, about the city, about harmless things. When she asked where I usually spent my evenings, I hesitated too long. I said, around, and hated myself for how small that sounded. She smiled politely and let it go. I didn't call her again. By the next week, the video had faded from conversations. New distractions replaced it. The world moved on the way it always does. But something else started happening. I noticed fewer people walking out of the cafe with cups. More empty chairs when I passed in the evenings. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle enough to doubt. I wondered if I was imagining it, or if Ellen was paying a price she hadn't asked for. One afternoon, the rain came down hard and sudden, the kind that pushes you inside without asking. I ducked under the cafe awning before I could stop myself. I stood there for a moment, listening to the water hit the pavement, arguing silently with my better judgment. Then I went in. The bell rang. A few heads turned. Ellen was behind the counter, talking quietly with a woman I didn't recognize. She looked up, saw me, and paused. Not startled. Not pleased. Just aware. I felt like I'd crossed a boundary I'd drawn myself. I just needed to go, I said, holding up my hand. Coffee to go. She nodded once. No questions. She poured, set the lid, and slid the cup toward me. No saucer. No sugar. Bare transaction. While I waited for the receipt, I noticed a piece of paper taped near the register. Printed text. Neatly aligned. I leaned closer. It was a statement. About privacy. About respect. About not turning people into stories without their consent. It didn't mention names. It didn't need to. At the bottom was Ellen's signature. I looked at her. You did this. Yes, she said. I needed to. For the cafe? I asked. For myself, she replied. That answer landed heavier than anything she'd said before. She hadn't waited for me to fix it. She hadn't asked me back. She'd handled it alone, the way people do when they've learned not to expect anyone to stay. I thought leaving would help, I said before I could stop myself. She met my eyes. It usually helps the person who leaves. There was no anger in her voice. That was the worst part. Just truth spoken without leverage. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, feeling the weight of another choice. I could apologize again, promise to be careful, ask to come back properly. Or I could accept that maybe the damage wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and that my absence had spoken louder than any joke. I didn't know how to be here without making it harder, I said. She nodded slowly. That's something you have to decide. Not me. I left without saying goodbye. Outside, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. I walked until my shoes soaked through, letting the cold settle into my feet like a reminder. That night, lying in bed, I understood something that took me longer than it should have. Distance isn't neutral. It's a choice. And sometimes it tells people exactly how replaceable they are. I didn't know yet if I was brave enough to close that distance again. What I did know was this. If I stayed away much longer, the decision would be made without me. The knock on my door came at 9:12 p.m., and for one stupid second I thought it was her. I stood up too fast, heart jumping before my pride could catch it. But it wasn't Ellen. It was my landlord holding a clipboard and that patient face people wear when they're done being flexible. Rent's due in the morning, he said. No more slipping. He wasn't threatening me. He was reminding me that my life had edges now. I shut the door, stood in the dark hallway of my rented room, and felt something settle in my chest. If I kept living like a man who could disappear, I was going to disappear for real. I grabbed my jacket and left before I could talk myself out of it. On the walk to Harbor Light, I rehearsed a dozen versions of what I'd say. One was an apology. One was a joke, like I hadn't learned a thing. The ugliest one blamed the town, the video, the gossip, anything except me. By the time the cafe windows came into view, warm and bright against the wet street, my stomach felt hollow. The bell rang when I pushed the door open. A few heads turned, then looked away, politely pretending they weren't curious. Ellen looked up and paused. Not angry, not relieved, just aware. I didn't take my corner seat. That would have been claiming something I hadn't earned. I walked to the counter, hands visible, voice steady only because I forced it. Ellen, I said, can I talk to you for 2 minutes? If you say no, I'll take my coffee and go. She poured a drink for a couple near the window, wiped the counter like she needed the motion, then nodded toward the small table by the back wall. 2 minutes, she said. That's what you asked for. We sat. The cafe sounded louder when I wasn't hiding. The refrigerator hum, a spoon against porcelain, a chair scraping softly. I wanted a clean opening. Instead, the truth came out rough. I left because I was scared, I said. Not of you, of what I do when I feel exposed. I disappear. I tell myself I'm being respectful, but really I'm saving myself. Ellen held still. You didn't disappear, she said. You chose silence. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes looked tired. Silence is a message, Michael. People pretend it's neutral. It isn't. For a second I wanted to defend myself, to say she didn't know what it felt like to be laughed at online. Then I remembered. She knew what it felt like to be watched in a small town. I swallowed the pride and let it burn. You're right, I said, and I don't want to be that man in your life. The one who shows up when it's easy and vanishes when it's inconvenient. She looked down at the table. My husband used to talk about meaning things, she said quietly. He meant them. Then one day he didn't come home. She lifted her eyes again. I'm not comparing you to him. I'm telling you why I don't gamble with words. When you joked about being my wife, it sounded like someone testing a door without thinking about what's inside. My throat tightened. I had a choice. I could stay safe with another apology and leave her alone. Or I could take the risk and tell her the truth that cost me something. I chose the risk. I don't have a neat life, I said. I've got debt. a landlord who's done being patient, and a pride that's been bruised so long it feels normal. I can't offer you a promise I can't keep, but I can offer you something real. I won't turn you into a secret, and I won't run the moment it gets uncomfortable. If I call you important, it won't be a joke. Ellen studied me the way she had that first night, and I could feel the room around us pretending not to listen. Then she asked, "What do you want from me?" The honest answer. My hands went warm. I could ask for comfort. I could ask to be saved. I could ask for closeness just to fill my empty room. Or I could ask for something smaller and harder. "Let me earn my place here," I said. "Not at that corner table. With you if you'll allow it. Slowly. If you say no, I'll respect it. But I won't pretend I didn't want it." Ellen exhaled, just barely. "Men are always late to their own honesty," she said, not unkindly. She stood, went behind the counter, and came back with a saucer. She set it between us. 2 sugar packets, not slid toward me, just placed there like a choice that belonged to both of us. "I can't promise you I won't get tired," she said, "or that people won't talk, or that my daughter won't have opinions. But I can promise you this. If you leave again, don't dress it up as kindness." I nodded. Then she pushed 1 sugar packet toward me and kept the other. A small, ridiculous gesture that felt heavier than any speech. The couple near the window laughed, and for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't feel like it was aimed at me. When I walked home, the rain had stopped and the streetlights made the pavement shine. I still had rent due in the morning. I still had problems that wouldn't soften overnight. But I also had something new, a line I could choose not to cross. And if you're wondering whether that's enough, I'll tell you what I told myself as I unlocked my door. For a man like me, it was the first honest step I'd taken in a long time. The scary part wasn't that Ellen might walk away. The scary part was realizing I finally didn't want to.